So this current research on minorities in Ukraine is rather new. I just started working on this research officially in September 2022, and but it's very much connected to what I was doing before. So firstly, to answer your question, how I arrived at this topic. So first of all, my previous research, my PhD dissertation, which turned into a book, was on cultural Sovietization of Ukraine in the interwar period. And when I was looking at the processes, the cultural history of Ukraine and the processes of constructing Ukrainian national identity during this period, it became obvious that minorities were also getting this protection, all these rights of linguistic development, of culture, like kind of development of literature. So this was not only the process of constructing Ukrainian identities, but constructing identities of all communities living on the territory of Ukraine. And this is something fascinating, because sometimes you see these examples when Ukrainian Soviet theater was on the same street as the Yiddish theater, right? So people interacted, but at the same time they created cultural products in different languages, and all this was supported by the state. So, and although my first book was mainly on the Ukrainian, kind of on the process of Ukrainization, so on the process of constructing Ukrainian cultural identities and national identities, but I was interested in minorities as well. So after I finished my PhD, I started thinking about a new research, and then, so minorities were already somehow behind, like kind of, I was already thinking about this as a gap in my research on the interwar Ukraine. But then there is also a family connection to this project, because my grandfather was of Polish origin, and it never occurred to me even to ask what it meant for him to be Polish. And he was born in the 1930s, so he was actually, his family was one of those repressed families sent to Archangel, so far in the north of Russia. Then they came back in the 1940s, so after the Second World War. So all this was very kind of present, but I never asked any questions, right? Why was it like this? You know, this was like something that we knew happened, but never really made it, you know, a subject of scholarly inquiry. And what was especially interesting for me that although he was of Polish origin, he never spoke Polish. In official setting, he would rather speak Russian. And the only kind of Polish element to it was that they were a Roman Catholic, so they would still go to the Polish kościół in my hometown. So that was actually very interesting to me, how kind of having this knowledge already of these affirmative actions, right, towards minorities in the interwar period, then I know the story of my grandfather, and I know it in connection to repression of these ethnic identities. So this was kind of a question to me, you know, how it all comes together. And I started, my first postdoc was on the minorities already, and the purpose of that research was to compare the treatment of Ukrainian minority, Ukrainian and Belarusian actually. The idea was Ukrainian and Belarusian minority in Poland, and the Polish minority in Ukraine and Belarus. Unfortunately, so I never managed to go to Minsk for archives, because this was, I think I started in 2018, and there was always something going on either in Ukraine or in Belarus, and then there was a pandemic, so I didn't really get to go to Minsk to work with Belarusian archives. But I worked a lot in Ukraine and in Warsaw, and basically I was looking at, my main concern was how those minorities policies became sort of mirrored this competition between the governments. So we have this sort of realpolitik, we have the competition between two governments, we have constant propaganda, anti-Polish and anti-Soviet propaganda, but then we have these numerous minorities on the ground, and how they became objects, or even like, you know, how they are manipulated for these higher purposes. So this was like a more perhaps focused study when I was just looking at the Polish minority with this kind of transnational element to it. And then again, it kind of occurred to me that the Polish minority, I mean, it became obvious that the Polish minority was not the only one subjected to those policies. There were a lot of other minorities, right? In 1926, 1/4 of Ukraine's population belonged to minorities. So it was a a very significant share of population. And all those minority groups, they were subjected to very similar policies from the state, from the party, but at the same time each minority group had their own sort of peculiarities. Poles were kind of seen as particularly dangerous because of the connection to Poland, and they were hugely assimilated during the imperial rule. Germans were more sort of loyal and obedient, and then they managed to preserve their kind of autonomy status and their language and their religion. Jews were the most numerous kind of minority group in Ukraine, kind of dominating Ukrainian urban centers. So there was this kind of, on the one hand, there was this similarity, but at the same time kind of differences. And this is the purpose of my research, to try to write a comprehensive history of those minority communities in the interwar Ukraine and see how all these pieces come together. Thank you. Yeah, it's indeed, this is something I think in the Western perspective we try to think about those changes and shifts in Soviet studies connected to the 24th of February, so just a year on. But actually, recently I realized that my first book, my PhD, and my current research, all these, like, kind of the findings have been affected by the war that started in 2014. So there somehow I can say that there have been no research on, no publication not affected by this knowledge of war, of kind of the need to perhaps reevaluate our perspectives and understandings on Ukrainian history. And I was also thinking about, like, kind of how would my research be different had it not been for the war, like that started in 2014. And what I'm thinking is that in a way I'm going again, and I think this is what the war brought about, that we are going against those main Western narratives that are just starting to shift in 2022 because of the events in 2022. But when I submitted my manuscript for publication, one of the comments I had, so where is Moscow in this story? Obviously, there were the same processes in Moscow, so why don't you tell the story of Moscow? And for me, it was self-evident that I'm telling the story of Kharkiv, right? The capital of Ukraine until 1936, that it had very little to do in this particular time with Moscow. And there is an episode in my book that I describe is a week of Ukrainian culture in Moscow in 1929, when the delegation of Ukrainian artists, Ukrainian cinematographers, Ukrainian writers, they go to Moscow to present the achievements of the kind of a decade of the Soviet Ukrainian culture. And they go there, and in their memoirs, in their recollections, they say, this is the first time we go to Moscow. We've been to Berlin, we've been to Paris, we've been, we studied in Vienna and so on, but this is the first time we go to Moscow to present our culture on a par with the Russian culture. And then during this week, Ukrainian writers meet with Stalin, and they challenge him constantly. They say, so what about the Ukrainian language? What about the Ukrainians in Kuban, this region that is ethnically kind of predominantly Ukrainian as part of Russia? What about the Ukrainians as Western Ukraine? Shall we kind of, unify those territories? Why Russian artists don't want to get translated into Ukrainian? It's not the same language. And all these questions are there. And this is 1929, 12 years after the revolution. This is something that we cannot see if we only look at this period from Moscow, right? Because we will not see those voices. And it's not a dissent. These people didn't have another understanding. They saw Kharkiv as their capital. They knew that Soviet Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, but they didn't see it as they saw it as a federation, right? And Soviet Ukraine was a separate state. And I think this is something that was obvious to me when I read the sources, because obviously there is a reference to Moscow, but they don't see themselves as translators of Moscow's decision. And this is one of the, perhaps, kind of those, differences in approaches that perhaps I wouldn't have seen before. But if we speak about the minorities policies, is actually, it's again, this question of decentering the Soviet studies, like kind of trying to look at kind of making Ukraine the focus of my research and see, because Ukraine was the first country to implement this experiment, and then it became a model for other Soviet republics. So obviously there was an intention translated from Moscow, but it was implemented and adapted and like perhaps kind of transformed in Kharkiv by those, and in Kyiv, I think there's the office for, like it was Kharkiv and then Kyiv. But anyway, it's like something very not regional in the sense that it was a region of Russia, but it's something, it's Republican, we can say. It's a Republican level, and it's perfectly possible to write this history without going to the Russian archives, because the documents are there. It's just the main, perhaps, declarations that like sort of that come from Moscow, but the rest is here, is in Ukraine. Well, of course, the main question now, and it hasn't been the case before, this is the access to archives that is basically is not very convenient to go to Ukraine. Let's say that it's not impossible, it's possible, but it's not very convenient. And especially if there are other considerations like family commitments or teaching, you can't really come and go, so this becomes very difficult. And another aspect that we all should be aware of is this ethical aspect, because if a researcher cannot go to archives, you know, him or herself, they look for a research assistant. But then there is a question whether we have the right to put those people in a potential danger, because one never knows what can happen, and in a way they are there for you. So these are these kind of questions that I keep thinking when I try to ask people to go for archives for me, and so on and so on. But at the same time, there is a sort of potential, because now a lot of foundations, so Western foundations, try to help archives digitize their collections. So we finally think that those sources, you know, that they can be destroyed, so they need to be preserved. And yeah, so there's a lot of kind of digitalization going on, which should potentially help not only me, but everyone who's interested in Ukraine to do their research. Well, yeah, it's thank you for recognizing it. It's indeed, this is a bracelet. This is it's made of steel. It's made of steel from Azovstal, a plant located in Mariupol, the city that has been basically destroyed together with the plant basically, and the city has been destroyed. And this was one of the fortresses of Ukrainian resilience. The first months of the war, and yeah, I bought this bracelet, and actually the way I got this bracelet is, you know, is very long. Basically, my mom, who received the bracelet, sent it to my sister, who is now in the UK as a refugee. Then my sister sent it to Bâle. So it's kind of, it was also a long way for me to get this bracelet. And I think, yes, indeed, this is the symbol of resilience of the Ukrainian people. But at the same time, you know, it's not that obvious. So it's kind of a discrete. So it's something mine, but people may not recognize it. And it's all right, you know, you don't need to flaunt your patriotism or your belonging to the country and so on. But this is something kind of, yeah, indeed, my feeling and my belonging to Ukraine.